a bit about Professor Sadurski. Wojciech Sadurski is a Challis professor in Jurisprudence in the University of Sydney Law School. He also holds a position of professor in the Center for Europe in the University of Warsaw and was a visiting professor in the University of Trento, Italy, Cardozo Law School, New York University's Law School, and Yale Law School. He was a professor of legal theory and philosophy of the law in the Department of Law at the European University Institute in Florence, and even served as the head of the department in the EUI between 2003 to 2006. He was written extensively on philosophy of the law, political philosophy, and comparative constitutional law. I'm honored to welcome Professor Sadurski for his presentation about populism and constitutional breakdowns.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here. I'm very grateful to Rייכman University, in particular to Professor Yaniv Rosnai and his entire team here. Being here, all the more so during these historically tense but important days, of which I could get a little bit of an experience yesterday, for me is not just honor, but also great enlightenment. So thank you very much indeed. I'll try to make it as short as possible, so that to leave enough time for Q&A, and then to make sure that a very prominent panel which will follow will not be held waiting. And therefore, you need to excuse me if I just run through some of the topics. I skip certain slides, don't be upset about it. But let me begin with a call to urge you to engage in a little thought experiment. And this is the thought experiment I have in mind. Suppose you've been just elected to a top position in your country, prime minister, president, depending on the constitutional system. You've been elected in free and fair elections, so you have good electoral mandate from your population. Majority of people, or at least the largest plurality of voters, voted for you. But you are not really a democrat at heart, and you would like to govern by monopolizing all the power, not respecting any restrictions on your power during your term. Most importantly, you would like to make sure that you will be re-elected in the next election. Of course, you cannot be absolutely sure about it, and there are certain things which you are not going to do, like use a great deal of force, etc. But you want to manipulate the system so as to maximize your chances of re-election. What do you do? So I suggest, as a starting point for my lecture, the following authoritarian playbook. Call it a decalogue. 10 things that you may like to do in order to achieve all those things. First of all, you start by depicting the opposition, people against whom you've won, as illegitimate, as the enemy of the people, not just a regular, legitimate members of the body politic, with whom you need to enter into compromises, whom you have to respect, etc., but rather your enemies, which you need to defeat so that to make sure that they are weakened before the next election. Second, and probably one of the first things early in the process, you will try to capture courts. You will try, especially, you want to make sure that the way judges are appointed is controlled by you. Probably it sounds familiar to that point. Third, you are in the situation of independent media, and you don't introduce like a censorship, prior restraint, anything like that, but you want to weaken them, to make sure that they are not too strong. Perhaps by asking your friendly entrepreneurs that they don't buy advertisement in those media which are critical of you. You don't give them access to certain information, etc. If you are in a state which has strong public media, you of course will capture them. You appoint your publishers, editors, journalists, etc., and you try to make sure that rather than remaining neutral and objective, that they become propaganda machine for your party. Then you have civil society, and you intimidate them. You try to depict, especially NGOs which are pro-human rights and therefore which may be very critical of you, you depict them as maybe foreign agents. You ask them to reveal all sorts of foreign grants because you starve them of your national grants, subsidies, and so on. But you will also try to make sure that there are some new NGOs set up which are pro-government, which will support you. Then there is civil service, law enforcement, police, prosecutors' offices, security services. You make sure that politicians control them. They are no longer independent force. Then you will make sure that your supporters are properly looked after from the point of view of their riches. That, for example, through various public procurement policies, through appointing people to the top positions in state-dependent or state-owned companies, that they are people who will owe you their gratitude and therefore repay their favors when you need it. You will make sure, especially when the election comes, in time before the next election, that electoral commissions are properly staffed. That is, that these are people who basically, if need be, maybe they won't engage in any obvious fraud, but they will be on your side. You restrict, even if only gently, freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. For example, you introduce certain new defamation laws, which will make it much more difficult for people to criticize you. For freedom of assembly or demonstrations or protests, you establish certain privileges for pro-government protests and at the same time discriminate against those which are critical of you. And finally, if your country belongs to a supranational body, such as the European Union, you play a game of cat and mouse. If the EU tell you, well, you can't do it, it's the rule of law, it's part of the EU law and policy, you lie to them, and then you will criticize them saying, well, look, this is interference in our domestic affairs, this is this sort of cat and mouse policy of at the same time pretending that you comply and criticizing them. Okay, that's the decade of authoritarian playbook. And now let me say, when you look at this slide, it's really not a thought experiment. This is exactly what Polish government did over the last 8 years or so, since late 2015. When they came to power, the government of law and justice, led by Polish de facto leader Jarosław Kaczynski, and a few months earlier, Andrzej Duda, their representative, was elected as president. That's exactly the playbook that they followed. So, if you want to learn, let me now remove this hypothesis. If you are really not an authoritarian at heart, but Democrat, you should look at it as a memento, as a set of warnings. If your government starts engaging in any of these things, it means that something really rotten is taking place. I have described this system in a great detail in a book which I published now 3 years ago called Poland's Constitutional Breakdown, which is like an anatomy of the constitutional and democratic backsliding in Poland. And then 2 years later, I have described it in a broader way, not just about Poland, but also about other populist authoritarian states, such as Hungary, the Philippines, India, at that time Brazil under Modi, in this book called Pandemic of Populists. And of course the title is not by random, because I have also written there still in the time of COVID. So let me now move to slightly more systematic description, or if you like, anatomy of what I call authoritarian populism. We can first define it in a negative way by saying what it is not. So I understand authoritarian populism as a certain hybrid system which is neither a consolidated, good, operational democracy, nor, on the other hand, fully fledged authoritarianism, which doesn't even make pretense that it has any democratic feature, or if it makes pretenses, as in, I don't know, Russia or Belarus or now Turkey, you know, its mandate to claim democracy is extremely weak. Now, authoritarian populism is neither a proper democracy nor complete authoritarianism. It is somewhere in there. But of course, it's only a negative definition, which is not sufficient. So let me now propose a multi-tier positive definition about what this authoritarian populism is. So the first characteristic, which is the most important, that's how I put it in bold character, is that the regime enjoys electoral pedigree based on free and by and large fair elections. By and large is of course a very important proviso here, because the fairness of the elections as the time goes by becomes weaker and weaker, but still we cannot really say that in the authoritarian populist states such as Poland, Hungary or India, elections are complete sham, are a facade. They are not. But if we have time, and I'm aware of the time constraints, I will present some departures from this fairness of the elections. Now the next thing is there is a very high degree of personalization of power, based on what is called charismatic leadership. Even it doesn't have to be charismatic in an ordinary sense of the word. You know, someone who is, I don't know, a great speaker and so on. This may be quite mediocre people, but charisma means that for people in the regime, in the elite of power, there is no real alternative to that one particular person. That's why when we talk about, notice that when we talk about authoritarian populists, we usually describe countries by the name of the leader. We say Orban's Hungary, or Modi's India, or Bolsonaro's Brazil, because somehow the regime is inseparable from the leader. These systems, and that's probably the most important thing, have abandoned separation of powers, whether you call it in a traditional European sense, tripartite separation of powers after Montesquieu, or more like the United States, checks and balances, which is much more, in a sense, chaotic and less architecturally pleasing. Nevertheless, what matters is all power, de facto, is concentrated in one pair of hands, rather than constrained by countervailing powers. So I call it mega-majoritarianism. Okay, the leaders enjoy majority support, or at least the largest plurality in the elections, and that for them is equivalent to support by all. So they represent the sovereignty of the people, at least in their rhetoric. Then there is something which is called in constitutional theory instantaneous democracy. That is that the decisions taken by the leader almost immediately become the law. So we don't have something to which we are used in liberal constitutional tradition, that in order for something to become a binding law, it must go through certain sequence, through certain motions. There are certain quote-unquote road bumps before a bill or a proposal becomes a law. You know, all sorts of audits, consultancies, multiple readings, etc. No, authoritarian populism rejects all that. There is an idea in the mind of the leader. Tomorrow the president or whoever there is will sign the law, and the parliament may operate even overnight. It is, in an important way, anti-institutional. But it is not in the sense that institutions or the inherited institutions from the former regime are abandoned. They are being hollowed out. I will explain what I mean a little bit later. And finally, all, I think without exception, all authoritarian populist regimes rely on some types of conspiracy theory, on some type of an official paranoia, which identifies an enemy, and the enemy is an epitome of everything that is evil, and the leader, our leader, is the only barrier between the evil and us. Okay? So whether it's a Jew like George Soros, or a Muslim, or a communist, or an atheist, or a liberal, doesn't matter. You know, the figures of the personification of evil differ from country to country, but there is always some idea of conspiracy which calls for total unconditional support to the leader. Now, let me say just a few words about populism, because I think that there is a certain temptation in the literature on populism, the temptation which we need to resist. And the temptation is to believe that if we talk about populism, then it is a single homogeneous phenomenon all over the world. So, and I say no, populisms in plural are a proper depiction. And I used to it as a sort of, I paraphrase the most famous first sentence of a novel ever written by Leo Tolstoy from Anna Karenina, who said, happy families are all alike, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I paraphrase it to democracy. A good democracies are all alike. Okay, slight exaggeration, but still. But every imperfect or defective or faulty democracy is faulty or defective in its own ways. And that is why when we think about populism, we need to think not only about supply of populist program, but most importantly about demand for populism. And demand for populism differs from country to country, because populism is an answer, a global answer, a wrong answer, a dangerous answer, but an answer to real problems. And real problems are different in different countries. And so we might identify different brands of populism by identifying a certain bundle, a certain package of demands which are salient in different countries. And here's my list of 5. There may be more. There may be 10, or there may be fewer, there may be 3. But I think that that's the way of approaching populism, by trying to see what it is in a given country that triggers demand for populist answers. So what I list is, and there's nothing original about it, it's taken from the literature, things such as status anxiety, xenophobia, anti-elite approach, anti-globalization, and anti-modernism. Okay, you can give it different labels. I hope it all is clear what it means. And the main point is, in different countries, these things occur in different constellations and in different configurations and with different intensity. And that's, I think, a proper way to understand populism, understand, most importantly, why there is demand for populism in a given country. So it's not enough to say populism is wrong, you know, I mean, Trump was wrong, or Bolsonaro was wrong. No, what it is that makes people to vote for them. So it's not just supply, it's also demand. And populism flourishes in the situation of polarization. Now, polarization by itself, there's nothing wrong about it. Polarization may be another word for diversity or pluralism. But that polarization which triggers populism is in many ways toxic. It is toxic in 3 ways. In the sense that it is radical, negative, and moralized. It is radical in the sense that the 2 camps, 2, if you like, segments of society start to drift away from each other. There is hardly any overlap. They stop talking to each other. The overlap is minimal, if at all. Okay? And we notice it all over the world, especially in the countries where populists are present, because that type of polarization is an ecosystem which favors populism. Secondly, it is negative in the sense that our, quote-unquote, hatred to them is stronger than our admiration or love of our own leaders. We are mainly moved in politics by dislike of the other than by the sympathy to our own. And it is moralist. Which means it's not only like a normal democracy, well, if you have voted for another party than I did, then I should believe that we are wrong. But it's not just that you are wrong. That would be a normal democratic disagreement. You are evil. You are a bad person. Either you are very stupid, or you are self-serving, or you are egoistic. You are someone who might have reason not just to disagree with, but also disrespect. And that is very special, very toxic type of polarization. Now, very often, the backsliding towards this authoritarian populism is almost invisible. And here the word backsliding is crucial, because I'm not talking about countries which were at that stage sort of as long as we may remember. We are talking about certain downward trajectory, about backsliding, about countries which have already achieved a certain reasonable degree of liberal democracy, and then something happens, and populists win, and we can see that, I don't know, in Freedom House or VDEM rankings or any other think tanks which rank democracies, the country suddenly goes down. But this suddenness is sort of relative, and for these three reasons which I identify on this slide, this descent, this degeneration, this erosion is often invisible. First of all, it is incremental, gradual, step by step. It's like overnight we wake up and there are tanks on the street. No, things happen slowly. And there is no single point, in which you can say, oh, it's a turning point. Today something happened that completely kills our democracy. No, we usually know about it only ex post, only when it's too late, because these are step-by-step changes. Secondly, what matters is not any single change, any legislative change, I don't know, to the Judicial Appointment Committee, or to the way the Parliament proceeds, or to media, etc. But it's about their mutual interaction. It's a little bit like a virus. The virus in itself may not be toxic, may not kill you. Actually, it may even strengthen you. But if the rest of the body is sick, its interaction may have toxic effects. And finally, and that's what renders this populist trajectory so invisible, especially to the outside observers, is that the old institutions remain intact. So the populists are not like Bolsheviks, who come to power and from now on there is no parliament, no courts, no nothing. No. All these institutions remain. But they are changed in a very significant way, which normally is called, they are being hollowed out. They are being hollowed out of their traditional rationale and function. Now, this hollowing out, of course, of the institutions is something which is a certain metaphor, and here I try to give a list, a taxonomy of various ways, various methods by which authoritarian populists hollow the institutions one. So first of all, the most obvious thing is capture. They put their own people there. Whether you are talking about electoral commissions, or about civil service, or about courts, they place their own loyalists there. Then there is another much more sophisticated way, is duplication. They create new authorities, which are constitutionally not envisaged, which are invisible, so to speak, to the Constitution, but which are fully controllable by the autocrats, and they sort of overshadow those original constitutional institutions. And now there is erosion. You erode them of competences, you erode them of money. Migration. You like in documents where you migrate one set of documents to another file, institutions are being removed from one context to another. For example, this in Poland, public prosecutor office became from an independent institution placed in the structure of Ministry of Justice. It of course changed everything. And finally, internal restructuring, Supreme Court of Poland. It still looks from the outside as being the same as it was before, but in fact it has been completely changed by having new chambers set up. Okay, you excuse me, but you don't thank me for not going into detail, but believe me, it's a completely different institution. Even from the outside, the shell is the same, but what's inside is completely new. And the last point, because I'm aware of the last point before the conclusion, I want to emphasize the question of courts. Because courts are so important, including in the place in which we are meeting today. And why courts are normally enemy number one, the target number one, I should say, of autocrats? For a very simple reason. because they present what I call an alternative legitimacy. For authoritarian populists, the only legitimacy which they boast and they respect is electoral legitimacy. And I said at the beginning, it's a definitional part of my understanding of populism, that their electoral legitimacy is genuine. However, a good democracy, a good complex democracy for a complex modern society must recognize multiplicity of legitimacies. There may be legitimacy based on expertise, right? There may be legitimacy based on courage. There may be legitimacy, I don't know, to special access to the truth, you know, if you are a religious person. And finally, there may be legitimacy based on impartiality combined with professions. And that is legitimacy of courts. But for authoritarian populists, this competition of legitimacy is something they cannot tolerate because that undermines their claim to uniqueness, to monopoly of legitimacy. And that is why they have to do what they have been doing in Poland, in Hungary, and perhaps under some interpretations what they are trying to do now in Israel. That is to remove any independence of courts, to make sure that judges will comply with politicians' will. And more importantly, that politicians will elect the very judges who will then have to control them. As simple as that. And that can proceed in different ways, by hostile takeovers, traditional court packing, and then courts become willful enablers. They themselves may be the engine of populism. I remember a text by Alon Harel and his co-author, whose name I have forgotten, Alon Harel from Hebrew University of Jerusalem, about legal populism or judicial populism, using some illustrations of Israel. I just, in my narcissistic moment, I decided to add also this photo where you can see yours truly in a Polish courtroom when in one of my multiple cases thrown against me by Polish populist regime, defamation cases, because defamation is one of the favorite methods of so-called discriminatory legalism. So they do use law, but they use law in a very selective way, to protect their own people, but at the same time to harass and persecute the opponents. And here the best motto is by someone called Oscar Benavides, who was president of Peru several times in the first half of the 20th century, who famously, perhaps infamously, said, "Everything for my friends, for my enemies will." Okay, let me finish with this last point. Well, let me finish with this last point. What now? Where to go from here? Because populism, authoritarian populism, even though it's a toxic, dangerous, and very unpleasant system, will not last forever. Some people believe that it has very low staying power, that because of the internal inefficiencies, dysfunctionalities, for example, suboptimal access to epistemic resources, if I may be so pompous in this statement. That is, that they don't promote the best people, but promote only the most loyal people. And they are usually mediocre because they have to be stupider than the leader, otherwise they would be challenged. You know, that this system has to fall. Unfortunately, I'm not as optimistic. We liberal Democrats have to help it fall. And I believe that in the countries which will observe as democratic, as sort of populist authoritarian, probably the only way to get rid of populists is an electoral way, simply to win elections. I know it sounds boring, unoriginal, non-innovative, but I don't think that any revolutionary way is helpful. There may be other ways. For example, countries which are member states of the European Union, like Poland and Hungary, may get some assets from its membership, but in the end, the elections must decide about removing populists from power. But there are certain strategies which should be used in the elections. In particular, I believe that high turnout favors Democrats in the situation of populist authoritarianism. There is some statistical evidence for that. Obviously, the unity of the opposition is a condition. It's not a guarantee, but it's a condition. It's a It's a prerequisite, it's a necessary though not sufficient condition. But without that you cannot win against populists. But of course it may well be that the unity of the opposition will become so thin that the new government will fall very soon, as was the case of Israeli government after 2021 election. But still, without that, without the unity, you cannot win against them. And convincing program. What does it mean? Well, that would be really the topic for a separate paper. That's something on which I'm working now. But the last one that I want to say is this. Elections, winning in the elections, is not just a matter of this phenomenon on the election day. That has to be prepared. Elections is just the last step in a long process of preparing victory against populists. And here, the main role should be played by civil society. So there must be high degree of mobilization of civil society for the elections to bring the anti-populist outcome. And I hope that what I've been seeing in Israel yesterday and what has recently started happening in Poland, especially after 4th of June, very successful demonstration in Warsaw, is sort of one step to that victory. Thank you very much.